Good evening, everyone. Very pleased to see such a great turnout for the first of our series in Easter term. And we're extremely pleased to welcome Dr. Toby Matthiesen to speak to us tonight. Toby's currently a senior lecturer in global Islam at the University of Bristol. But he's a seasoned researcher who's held fellowships at Oxford, Cambridge, at Caliph and at Stanford University. And he's published a number of different works with a research focus on the Arabian Peninsula, which is often an area which is missed out when we think of the Middle East and North Africa. So we're absolutely delighted to have someone coming from that research perspective to talk to us today. His books have tended to look at sectarianism and Shii communities in spaces where we may not think of them as existing. His first book, The Sectarian Gulf, was published in 2013, and then The Other Saudis was published in 2014. And based on that research and his deeper thinking about the role of sectarianism in the history of the Middle East and the Islamic world more generally, he's now written a massive and impressive tome, The Caliph and the Imam, The Making of Sunnism and Shiism, published by Oxford University Press in 2023, which is a very deep but also broad dive into the evolution of what we now call Sunnism and Shiism, and how those isms, if you like, have developed over many centuries. And we're absolutely delighted to have Toby come to talk to us tonight. So I'm sure you will join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Amira, and everyone else for inviting me and making this happen. It's a great pleasure to be back in Cambridge. I will be talking to you today about, this topic. Amira told me I'm not really allowed to talk so much about my book because this is not a book talk series, but I'm afraid there is going to be, a couple of things about the book in there. However, I will try not to be too sort of schematic in the whole process. This is, the cover, but basically I want to explain you why I decided to write this book and sort of, what was my journey while doing so. And in the end, sort of, what I hope the contribution of the book will be. And I hope you will permit me actually to do a bit of reading today as well. So to sort of elaborate that perhaps in a bit more thorough language and in a more thorough way, but also giving you a bit of a feel of the partly anthropological nature and sort of, the bottom-up dynamics that I'm also hoping to describe. And that sort of drove me also to write this book and also to problematize sort of, the kind of standard assumptions about this topic. So I'm reading from the prologue. The midday sun struck the gilded dome built over the grave of Hussein, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, blinding anyone who dared to look up at it. It was the spring of 2019. I was sitting inside the shrine located in the holy city of Karbala in Iraq, attending a conference intended to promote and celebrate Hussein as a universal figure. I was among a few dozen guests, all gathered at a site which over centuries has been both a place of fervent worship and heavy fighting. Here took place the massacre of Hussein and his followers in the Battle of Karbala at the hands of an army sent by the Umayyad Caliphate based in Damascus. The shrine was often contested between competing powers espousing Sunnism and Shiism. It was ransacked by Wahhabi zealots in 1802 and bombarded by Saddam Hussein's tanks in 1991. Plaques around the shrine nowadays commemorate these events, and even the latter, for example, with bullet holes in the marble walls. After the US-led invasion of Iraq of 2003, it became a symbol, the shrine, of a newfound Shii self-consciousness. And when the so-called Islamic State declared a caliphate in northern Iraq and eastern Syria in 2014, it vowed to turn to rubble the idolaters and tomb worshippers' holy sites at Najaf and Karbala. In response, tens of thousands of Iraqi Shia, urged on by Iraq's senior Shii cleric, took up arms to defeat IS. And, at the time of when I was doing this research, you could still see the paramilitaries celebrating in front of the shrine. Karbala is thus to many both the birthplace of the Sunni-Shia split, but also epitomizes how Sunni and Shia have been at odds ever since. And however, as I'm explaining now, is something much more complicated and deeper than that. So that morning in 2019, on the podium in front of Hussein's grave, both Sunni and Shii dignitaries praised Hussein as a unifying figure. Given the polarization and violence of recent years, this was remarkable. Hussein is, of course, an especially important figure for Shia, who see him as an Imam, the rightful political and spiritual successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Less known, however, is that Sunnis and Sufis especially likewise hold Hussein in high regard and feel he was wronged. Karbala and many other shrines associated with the family of the Prophet Muhammad, the Ahlul Bayt, constituted not only Shia sites of memory, but similarly places where adherents of various confessions and faiths could come together without focusing on differences. The symposium offered the hope of celebrating this inclusive heritage of Islam, and it served as a corrective to standard narratives of perpetual Sunni-Shii strife, and also got me thinking much more deeply about these questions. Because the question of the nature of relations between Sunnism and Shiism preoccupied me for a very long time, indeed, since I first started engaging with the Middle East and the wider Islamic world after 9/11 and the Iraq War. Before the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the 2003 Iraq War, terms such as Sunni and Shii were little used outside of specialist literature. So you can almost not find them on Google Books, for example, or other search machines. Yet within a few months of the invasion, Western media and politicians invoked them to explain the conflict in Iraq and much of the region's ills, and that continues today. Many argued that the two sides had resented and fought each other for nearly 1,400 years. This description of Iraq as sectarian served both to deflate blame from the American-led administration and, in a circular logic, also to legitimize reshaping Iraqi politics along sectarian lines, both of which was happening at the same time. Simplistic narratives of binary opposites, of Islam and the West, of Sunni and Shia, made me wary. I decided to dig deeper, and over the years of research, fieldwork, and many conversations with really people from very different backgrounds and different places, realized that Sunnism and Shiism have a long and complicated history, but that standard narratives fall way short of explaining it. It took centuries for Shiism and Sunnism to develop, and even the very terms to start to be described to a very large and diverse group of movements, several centuries, in fact. Neither the coherence of the two nor the dividing line between them were always clear, nor always conflict-prone. And this I first, for example, saw in Cairo, right, where one still sees the legacy of the Fatimids everywhere. And although that is somewhat repressed in Egyptian memory culture, that sort of Shii Fatimid legacy, it still sort of, obviously problematizes very quickly these sort of standard narratives. But I also realized that Sunni-Shii relations played out across a much wider geographical area than often assumed. And I'm afraid I'm also going way beyond the Arabian Peninsula or even the Gulf region, although they are central, but really the aim here is also to decenter really Islamic history. So while the Arab world is often associated with Sunnism today and Iran with Shiism, Shiism played a much larger role in the history of the Arab world and of the Eastern Mediterranean, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent than commonly assumed. And so did Sunnism, of course, in Iran. The next speaker up on the podium that day, an Egyptian poet, a graduate of Al-Azhar University, perhaps the most important seat of Sunni learning, who recited a verse lamenting the martyrdom of Hussein and extolling how much Egyptians as well honor Hussein, demonstrated this. Many Egyptians, for example, believe that in 1153, the Fatimids transferred the head of Hussein to Cairo, their capital. There they interred it and would hold mourning processions for his martyrdom and celebrations for his birthday. The Fatimids also founded, of course, Al-Azhar University, initially as a Shii institute of learning. And the Sunni rulers that deposed the Fatimids in 1171 restructured it as a Sunni university. But even though still it has often facilitated Sunni-Shii dialogue, especially also in the 20th century. And although their Sunni successors vowed to suppress the Fatimids' legacy, it lived on in the built environment, in popular culture, and elsewhere. Sufis still gather today at the Hussein Mosque in Cairo to celebrate Hussein's birthday, singing and dancing ecstatically. How intertwined the history of Shiism and Sunnism was made even more explicit by the next speaker up on the podium, Baba Mundi, the leader of the Bektashi Sufi order, which today has its headquarters in Albania. Although some Sufis are staunchly Sunni, most trace their spiritual lineage, their silsila, to the Prophet through Ali, his son-in-law, founding figure of the Shia and father of Hussein. But some Sufis, like the Bektashis, are therefore considered pro-Shii, although in history they have, of course, long allied with Sunni rulers, as we will also see. Baba Mundi was in Karbala to sing the praises of Hussein as well, and to celebrate Karbala's firm place in the minds and hearts of Sufis and those of Balkan Muslims more generally. A few months after this Karbala conference, I joined him and tens of thousands of Bektashis on a journey up Mount Tomor in Albania to visit the shrine set up for Abbas ibn Ali, a half-brother of Hussein, who had died fighting alongside Hussein at Karbala, and for whom another major shrine exists in Karbala, of course. The days-long festival in Albania exemplified that Karbala could mean different things to different people at different times. Fire, for example, played a very important role there. And I must say it was a night-long party where alcohol flowed freely, which I can assure you is not the case in Karbala itself. Many more shrines and rituals further afield link themselves to Karbala and the family of the Prophet in locally specific ways. Other examples include, for example, the Ali Shrine in Mazar-e-Sharif in Afghanistan, discovered several centuries after Ali's death, and where many Central Asian Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, believe Ali is indeed buried, though most Shia outside of Afghanistan believe he is buried in Najaf. Indian Shii dynasties built replicas of the Imam's shrines and brought memorabilia associated with them to their cities to serve as a focus of popular piety. The reenactment of the Imam's suffering and pilgrimage to these sites have made the cultural memory relevant in the present and have linked Shia and many Sunnis to Karbala in myriad ways. What I grasped from these and other interactions with Sufis was that Sufism was especially important as a counterpoint to simplistic accounts of Sunni-Shia relations, because Sufis often disregarded doctrinal or legalistic dividing lines, for example, between Sunni and Shia as defined by the clergy. And I realized how important and emotionally compelling key sites of memory like Karbala and Damascus were. After the Battle of Karbala, the remains of the family of the Prophet slain at Karbala and the wives and children that had been spared in the battle were brought before Yazid and the Umayyad ruler in Damascus. So was the head of Hussein. It was, as noted, later moved to Cairo, while his body was interred in Karbala. The Umayyads, a family that was part of the old Meccan aristocracy and had initially fought against the Prophet Muhammad, but then embraced the message of Islam, saw themselves as the rightful rulers of Syria and the wider Muslim community and the successors to the Prophet, in other words, as caliphs. They stood in sharp opposition, of course, to Ali, whom Shia see as their first successor to the Prophet and their first spiritual and political leader, or Imam. It was from Damascus that they had organized the campaigns against Ali in the mid-7th century that became known as the First Muslim Civil War, or Fitna, Unsurprisingly, Shia detest the Umayyads, though many Sunnis also regret their quarrels with Ali and Hussein. Although some Sunni revivalists in the modern period, especially also now in South Asia, lionize them. As an Arabic language student in the 2000s, I spent many days in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and in surrounding areas, marveling at the depictions of the Paradise Garden and the past glory of the Umayyad Caliphate, of course, as well. Here, this is a trope that, of course, earlier European Orientalists always picked up, but it was sort of hard to resist as well in many ways. This is also something, that comes up a lot in the book, in a way, once European travelers and Orientalists travel to the region and start to sort of categorize these differences and put them down on paper and edit sources, that's really a sort of a defining moment also for sort of more hardened sectarian identities. And anyway, Damascus was often, of course, a way in for them. Nevertheless, and therefore they immediately obviously felt affinity with the Umayyad Caliphate as sort of mainstream Islam, right? It's a trope that actually exists until today. Nevertheless, the longer I spent in Damascus, the more I noticed that Shii pilgrims from Iran, Lebanon, the Gulf states, or beyond would also visit the Umayyad Mosque and nearby shrines associated with the family of the Prophet, such as Sayyida Zainab, located some 6 miles to the southeast of Damascus center, where Shia believe that Zainab, a granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad and daughter of Ali, is buried. Zainab and other survivors of the Karbala massacre were brought to Damascus and held captive by Yazid in the Umayyad Mosque, where Zainab allegedly gave a speech condemning her brother's murder and held the first mourning ceremony. Sunnis generally believe she's buried in the Sayyida Zainab Mosque in Cairo. And as you already see, burial places are, of course, sites of shared memory, but actually in some of the key figures, there's actually a different debate about where they are buried, and often Sunnis and Shias don't necessarily agree. Like Hussein, Zainab is central to Shiism, yet is a notable descendant of the Prophet and a powerful female figure for Sunnis too. In Damascus was thus commemorated the greatness of the Umayyads alongside the founding story of Shii suffering, the tragedy of Karbala, and the ways in which the Umayyads, who had taken over the mantle of the Prophet and proclaimed themselves caliphs, treated the Imams and their kin and followers. That both Sunnism and Shiism, and indeed the pre-Islamic past, could be commemorated in the same space and in others dotted around this ancient city and many other cities in the region, was testament to a shared heritage and lived reality of Islam and Middle Eastern religiosity more broadly. At other times, however, especially sort of now in the more recent past, these sites of memory were appropriated by competing powers. They represented both what one scholar termed an architecture of coexistence and the emotionally compelling and competing narratives of Sunnism and Shiism. Over the nearly 2 decades that I spent engaging with the people of the Middle East and the wider Islamic world, I encountered many examples of coexistence, ambiguity, but also of polarization. Shrines in the post-Ottoman world and on the Indian subcontinent and Muharram processions in India, attended by Shia and Sunnis, are examples of the former. Mourning the death of Hussein and his companions in battle and atonement for not having saved Hussein could both assert Shii difference, but also, were times, and Sunnis have sometimes criticized Shia for it, but these could also become inclusive festivals at which Sunnis invoke Hussein. And this is still the case, actually, in many places from the Caribbean to India itself. Sunni revivalists I engaged with in northern India and Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, strongly refuted Shiism. They often called it, including in personal conversations and in their writings, a deviant sect or not part of Islam at all, and warned me, for example, against going to Shii areas with wild rumors of the practices that were, carried out there, and that it was not possible to trust Shia because they might perform dissimulation, taqiyya, to which over the centuries Shia sometimes have been forced to resort to for self-preservation. This was a common trope in anti-Shii polemics, even if it was much less frequently used than these polemics made Sunnis and also many Orientalists who wrote about it believe. Many Shia, on the other hand, I met, held similar prejudices towards Wahhabis, a term widely sometimes applied to Sunnis. While they want Sunnis to accept them as a valid branch of Islam, most Shia believe that they constitute a chosen group of Muslims. On both sides, thus, prejudices and conspiracy theories at times exist. But these issues did not lead to conflict in and of themselves. I really argue very strongly in this book. And I'm not the first one, obviously, to argue that sectarian identity is most salient, I think, when it is related to politics. But I prove it, I think, through quite a lot of sort of historical examples from different places and periods. This was evident in many of the countries that I visited during my research. In Bahrain, for example, Sunnis and Shia have long lived side by side. There was also, intermarriage. Many of the more secular political movements had joined membership and so on and so forth. And so many stories I always heard of friendships and so on and so forth. And Sunnis also used to partake in Muharram processions and so on and so forth. Sunni-Shii tensions stem from the island's history as a province of Iran in previous centuries, and then its conquest by a Sunni ruling family in the 18th century and the disenfranchisement of its native Shii population, a pattern that entrenched itself under British protection. So, for example, in Bahrain, one sees actually quite well how the different periods and actors sort of hang together. After the Iranian Revolution, the Shia's pent-up resentment intersected with the appeal of the revolution and the Gulf rulers' fear of a region-wide Shii rising. Many Lebanese have long tried to transcend the limits of sectarian identity as institutionalized under the French Mandate. In fact, more than it was ever institutionalized before under any form of Muslim rule. A system symbolized nowadays by the huge posters of political leaders and the flags of sect-based militias and parties on streets across the country, but to little avail. And even the most recent protests did not manage to really, transform that political system. In Syria, the Ba'ath Party's nationalist rhetoric positioned itself against that colonial legacy, rendering sectarian identity officially a taboo, which one wasn't allowed to talk about. The regime's ubiquitous informants wanted to stamp out all talk of difference while relying on the support, largely, of course, of non-Sunnis who dominated eventually the highest echelons of the state and the security services that policed the country. In Iran, the Shia clerics in charge officially embraced Islamic unity and its Sunni minority. So there are famous rulings from Khomeini, for example, on the status of Sunnis in Iran after the revolution. But Shiism and a sense of ethnic superiority were so pervasive and so coupled with the ambition to become a major power that I understood why its Sunni and Arab neighbors feared its revolution and why Sunni Iranians and others feel like second-class citizens. And in Iraq, a country in which centuries of Ottoman rule and then the British had enshrined Sunni supremacy, competing cultural memories rooted in the many sites across the country associated with the early split, like Karbala, were reconstituted after the US-led intervention brought to power the first Shia-led government in a millennium. When a civil war engulfed Iraq shortly afterwards, the Americans and their allies, as noted, quickly blamed ancient hatreds rather than their own lack of post-invasion planning, while simultaneously institutionalizing ethno-sectarian divisions in ways reminiscent of earlier French and British imperial policies. The conference in Karbala was an example, actually, of this Shia empowerment, of course, absolutely unthinkable before 2003. And while it reached out to Sunnis, it did now so from a position of strength. Despite the overwhelming evidence, both historically and contemporary, that it is the interaction of doctrinal tensions with political ones that lead to conflict, many still see Sunnism and Shiism as perpetually at loggerheads and invoke Sunni and Shii as catch-all terms to explain division and bloodshed in Muslim societies. The notion that ancient hatreds divided Sunni and Shii and that the two were polar opposites throughout Islamic history persists, not least in the public debate and amongst decision makers, and in fact, sometimes even amongst decision makers in the region, as well as amongst scholars working on especially polarized periods and places who are sometimes unaware of contrasting examples and completely contrasting literatures, for example, from other countries. Some argue that doctrinal debates a millennium ago explain violence today, right? Ibn Taymiyyah and so on and so forth, uncritically invoked today. Others solely focus on the impact of the modern state and the interventions of regional and global powers, or see sectarian conflict as purely a product of material struggles, often refusing to take history seriously and make connections with previous periods, or to engage with doctrinal debates, now more sort of modern historians and social scientists. It is against these simplistic notions that reduce Sunni-Shii relations to conflict and doctrinal tensions, or that argue that history and doctrinal debates don't matter at all, that I chose to write this book. It's not a history of everything, and of course some things had to be left out. The early period is not covered in as much detail. Nonetheless, it's the first history of Sunni-Shii relations from the 7th until the early 21st century, based on fieldwork and a thorough synthesis of existing scholarship from different disciplines in major research languages. And I will say something about that in just a minute. It firstly tries to show that it is vital to understand how Sunnism and Shiism develop chronologically and doctrinally, and how earlier periods shape later ones. History matters, of course, and only by understanding the early and middle periods can we understand how later ones constituted themselves with reference to them. But secondly, and also importantly, I think, what I'm trying to do here is really, connect different regions. And this is something that was also not so easy for me because, I was trained as a historian of the Arab world, and while I did Persian, my expertise was largely limited sort of to Iran and the Arab East. But in this context, what was really crucial is also sort of the whole history of the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and then all the Central Asian and North Indian sort of debates. And there, I must say, this was also in part sort of a reaction to. So I had a postdoc fellowship here at Pembroke. It was lovely. And there were all these, I must say, sometimes one felt the Middle East was not the main focus of other people working in the university, which is fine because it forces you to sort of engage with other things. And sort of in history, there was, the whole sort of global history crowd and everybody basically working on India and the British Empire. So every time I spoke about my project, they sort of asked me, so how does India fit in here? Like, what is this? Doesn't make any sense. It was basically, it's all about India. And I must say, I didn't really have a good answer at the time. And now 10 years later, after a lot of reading and also quite a lot of traveling in India, I realized that, well, maybe they were right, or at least, we don't need to completely disregard the Middle East, but definitely one needs to find a way to sort of tell the story in a connected way, and especially this story of the Sunni-Shii relationships, because, I will, explain that perhaps now in a bit more detailed way. But one of the things that I really realized is that for example, the literature on the Ottoman Empire has grown tremendously in the last decade or two, and it's now so detailed, including about these questions. But that literature is hardly ever sort of taken up by sort of modern historians or historians of the Arab world of the 20th century, or especially also by political scientists, of course, working on these questions. And likewise, the literature on British India and also the source base and the availability of sources is so vast. And Sunni-Shii relations were very important actually in that context for many centuries, that it's really important to look at this sort of together. So basically, the book is trying to do two things: be both a longue durée and a global history of confessionalization in Islam, of Sunni-Shii relations. And that was maybe a bit of an overambitious, idea. But anyway, it took me took me quite a lot of years, but now it is here. And I think, well, there's some things that can be taken away from that. Another thing that I really wanted to do, and that I was, quite shocked actually at, the longer I spent sort of in Anglophone academia, in Cambridge and Oxford, of course, knowledge of the region's language is important, and many people still do sort of read French to a certain extent. German is falling really out, and perhaps, as you can tell, my native language is German, so the first sort of literatures, and I'm Swiss, so my second language is French. So the first two languages that I sort of read in, about this, academia debates were German and French. And so I was really shocked actually by the ways in which the literatures had become totally, not completely disconnected, but basically especially the German and French literatures, in other fields as well, but especially on this vast area of scholarship, were no longer really read or cited or engaged with. So one of the big aims of the book, and if you ever have a look at it, has quite an extensive notes section, which actually this was one of the reasons, because especially the German and French literature on many things, early Islam, but also the different empires, specific polemics, specific figures, the Ottoman Empire, of course, and then, of course, various imperial formations, the French Empire, and so on and so forth. But also more contemporary debates is really vast, and there's a totally untapped reservoir of PhD dissertations and so on and so forth that then don't really make it into wider Anglophone academia. So this was a big sort of aim of the book, and I think explains in part why it ended up being so long. But of course, also really engage with the debates on the ground. And I mean, I don't really, a major lack is sort of engagement with Turkish or Ottoman Turkish, which I'm, really struggling to read. But Arabic debates, and to a certain extent, Persian debates as well. So, I mean, I said I shouldn't really tell you too much about how the book is structured and so on, but I mean, I think I will still sort of do it a little bit. I mean, one of the important things sort of about the early phase, and the early phase in terms of this book is really very vast, because the book, in a sense, sort of has a major break in the middle, and the middle, that's around 1500, when we see the formation of sort of a different type of early modern Muslim empire that is also, I think, comparable sort of with European empires. And we see a number of conversions taking place, and sort of, sectarian identity becoming much more central to state formation. In these previous centuries, that is not so much the case, and therefore they're all sort of, it's a very long sort of part that just introduces sort of the basic basic trends and so on and so forth. But what is really crucial here and there is also sort of, I'm trying to bring together a huge set of literature, for example, on all these pilgrimage sites, on Ahlul Baytism as an idea, right? There's a vast literature now on that, and connect that with sort of early dynastic formation, which actually at times did embrace specific sectarian identities, of course. And one can think here, for example, of the Fatimids and the Buyids, and so on and so forth. But these states were really very different, I argue, from what comes later. So in some ways, the book has a certain political science approach, but trust me, if I present this to political scientists, they will just run away, 900-page book with loads of references in other languages. That's not. But in a sense, the transforming nature of the state is a key theme here, and how, religious identity interacts with the state. But also, one has to problematize these sort of standard narratives that you still find in the textbooks, notions like the Shii century, the Sunni revival, and just the idea that these states, the dynasties sort of controlled their territory even, or could tell people really how, they should practice religion. This was not really the case. However, precedents, let's say at the end of the 12th century or something like that, we did have actually precedents from all Islam's three main branches, from Sunnism, of course, but from various forms of Shiism and Ibadism or Kharijism, as all of them attempted to rule and did rule for prolonged period of time, and established a sort of a codex for the judiciary, and so on and so forth. So there was a legacy of political rule that, for example, Ismailis were of course then removed from power and never really attained political power again. But there, was created a legal corpus which in principle could be applied later. And that, for example, had a massive impact on the development of Shii law. So even though, perhaps, for example, Shii political rule only really, was established quite later, you had these sort of precedents. And that's, I think, quite important. And of course, some of the earliest polemics that are still invoked happened during this time, and in part during this sort of emerging of the Mongol Mamluk rivalry. And I thank Charles here, who's sort of present for coming, but also, he for reading one of my chapters. I mean, I must say, sometimes I also asked an expert in that particular field to have a look. But sort of this rivalry had, of course, confessional overtones, and this polemic happened at that time in this particular moment. But again, I think it's quite different from, let's say, even the rivalries that I'm now going to look at in the 16th century. And the ways in which this polemic is used today is, of course, completely, taken out of context and deterritorialized in a very postmodern way, in fact. So you can perhaps imagine what sort of the part two, sort of the core part, I think, of the book is about. It's about these sort of empires which have been called, gunpowder empires. Again, that term is sort of being criticized, but nonetheless, they all conquered vast amounts of territory. They, in general, held it for a long time. Then they fought against each other at the various borders they established. Some of these borders, continue to exist even after the respective dynasties declined, and almost all of them had a particular sort of, interpretation of Islam that they espoused, at least on a personal and on that sort of elite circle level. In the case of the Safavids, of course, they also converted Iran to Shiism. Iran was previously a majority Sunni country, so therefore completely changing the dynamics of the whole wider sort of global history of Sunni-Shii relations, and therefore they also really deserve proper consideration. The others are, of course, the Ottomans, who you see controlled and of course controlled such vast and strategic areas. And then also the Mughals and various Uzbek rulers as well. And here one can really speak, I think, of a Muslim age of confessionalization. And in this part of the book, I engage a lot with sort of debates in European history. I mean, one of the arguments or one of the aims of the book is really also to in some ways, at least, decolonize the way in which we talk about, comparative religion and Islam. So try not to fall into the trap of using, for example, sect and church, right? Sort of this Weberian notion of of sociology of religion, which did have an impact actually on the study of Islam, but in Islam really doesn't make any sense. And I think that's one of the things I'm trying to show. But also so trying to use terms that are actually used in the respective societies and languages. So basically not trying to refer to, orthodoxy or heterodoxy or such terms. Nonetheless, the process of confessionalization is quite a specific term that exists sort of in European history about the ways in which, specific rulers engaged with new forms of Christianity, different strands of Protestantism, and the various sort of wars that followed from that, and also a newfound sort of commitment to the faith and to, defending it and converting others to it, also sort of on an interpersonal and local level. And I think with that sort of definition, we can see actually similar processes at play in the wider Islamic world, and also processes that, in fact, where these European rivalries, obviously, especially, for example, the Habsburg rivalry with the Ottomans, sort of reinforced each other, right? So the Habsburgs identified themselves much more strongly as Christian rulers in return, the Ottomans much more strongly as Muslim rulers. And then that in return, in the rivalry with the Safavids, they became more sort of a self-conscious Sunni power, and the Safavids more a Shii power. So you have also these strong interactions, and also sort of the stronger relationship between a specific territory and a specific confessional identity. Now, since I gave you this sort of introduction that we, have to problematize all these sort of binaries and so on and so forth, it is, of course, very important to note that in that sort of Ottoman-Safavid rivalry, things were much, much more complicated than they are, presented, let's say today, or in a very shorthand account. And here is actually one place where the literature has advanced tremendously on this whole question of the Kizilbash, right, which were these populations bordering the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire, and sometimes, allying with one and the other times with other. And it's quite clear that although, of course, in principle, they sort of supported the Safavids as a sort of, spiritual patrons, things are much, much more complicated. And we have actually a tremendous amount of very detailed local studies that really, problematize this sort of easy easy Sunni-Shii sort of dichotomy in many ways. And of course, the Ottomans eventually had as their sort of main Praetorian Guard a sort of Bektashi, Kizilbash, Ahlul Baytist sort of doctrine, and even had sort of the sword of Ali on their banners and so on and so forth. So in this period, we also find countless sort of counterexample to this sort of binary story. Nonetheless, I think in this period, 1500 to 1800, there is definitely a sort of entrenching of a particular confession in particular territories, and also sort of a deepening, of a relationship between particular states and particular sectarian identity, and also repeatedly invoking that in carrying out raids and wars against your neighbors, right? So almost all of these states in some way or another invoked clerics to say the other party is not Muslim, right? Because in principle, Muslims shouldn't go to war with each other, Muslim states. So the sectarian division was often a way to say, well, actually, they're not really Muslims, so we can actually go and fight them, and we can enslave them, and so on, or we don't need to treat them as Muslims in war. So this was definitely something that happened, and in fact happened even, for example, in India, where you had then local rulers sort of embracing one side or the other, and sometimes you also had sort of minor rulers embracing a confession that wasn't very prominent in that area, so they didn't really have to pay taxes anymore to the main power in the region. This happened, for example, a lot with the Murals. Once the Murals lost power, you had local sort of Shii dynasties saying, well, actually, we're now independent and we don't actually accept your sovereignty anymore. And that is partly also, has partly to do with these more practical matters. And here you obviously see an image of Lucknow, and I must say that whole sort of Indian angle was incredibly important to me, as I mentioned, especially also explaining then once Britain, the East India Company really starts to get so much involved in the Islamic world. I mean, in India, but on the whole, obviously, overseas path towards, the whole Indian Ocean and so on and so forth, and engages with all of these different actors and different movements, the different faith confessions across in East Africa, in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, Southern Arabian Peninsula, and then all the way to Pakistan and India and Iran and so on and so forth. So the British really, in many ways become sort of the Muslim superpower, but they also, because they engage with so many different sects and so on and so forth, they also start to sort of codify and ascribe more closely sort of, you know, you are that and you are this and so on and so forth. And this especially starts to become very prominent in British India once it becomes sort of more directly ruled, or in territories that become more directly ruled. And I must say the sources are really, you know, very terrific, because they allow you to make your case in such a, you know, easy way that it's almost a bit too easy. Let's say, from trying to do research in Eastern Saudi Arabia, I couldn't imagine how the things in India, so everything's in English and just available. But one of the things that, for example, happened is that the British Indian government decided to do a census. Yeah, and in the census, basically for Muslims, you know, they introduced caste, obviously for non-Muslims. And for Muslims, the equivalent of caste was basically sect. So, and then the first sort of 1 or 2 censuses, but almost nobody ticked that box, because and they did a study. So why did nobody tick this box? You know, there was Sunni-Shii, Ismaili, sort of Hoja, and then Ahmadi started to emerge later. But basically they realized, well, many people had never thought of this question. What was there, I mean, or didn't know what the terms meant. So this was just an incredibly, you know, visual depiction sort of how the modern state interacted. And beyond, so the study then concluded, beyond an elite level, especially at the Shia elite level, which really identified as Shia, almost much of the normal population just said, we're Muslims, you know, we're not either or. And then only after being repeatedly asked in the census, and then sometimes people were asked to show how they pray, and then the sort of British Indian commissioner said, well, actually the way you pray, that's the Shii way or the Sunni way, so you're now classified at that, and that remains your caste. So this was one way in which this happened. Another important way was through the codification of Islamic law, especially personal status law, and the integration of that into the judicial system in India, but also in other parts of the British Empire. And that's also something that happened, for example, in Iraq after 1920. You know, British Anglo-Mohammedan law, as it was then called, was then used for the first time to sort of separate Sunnis and Shias in the judicial system. Under the Ottomans, this had never happened. So in many cases, you obviously changed informal arrangements, and there is a lot of scholarship on that, but it doesn't often talk about the sectarian dimension. So you had a lot of informal arrangement where, for example, local imams would sort of regulate, let's say, you know, conflicts or, you know, divorce, something like that, before, without it ever really being registered with the state. So in practice, you had a certain, you know, application of Shii law, but never on a formal level. So the Ottomans never allowed that, and it was actually a very, you know, tense point, for example, in their relations with Iran or with some of the foreign missions, actually, who worked for that. But it was only really the modern European colonial state that recognized, you know, sectarian identity in different ways, especially in personal status law, and that is something that has remained with us ever since. And you know, we know that that really reinforces your sense of sectarian belonging. And this actually happened already in around 1800 in some of the East India Company ruled provinces of India. So I then make sort of the argument that, yeah, as I mentioned, this then really applied in many ways to the mandate system, where you then had the similar processes which were already happening in the 19th century, really implemented in some of these core countries, especially in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, with their very diverse religious background. And in many ways, you know, similar processes happened, of course, in Palestine, although, of course, not with the Sunni-Shii divide as a major dividing line, but more with a religious nationalist dividing line. And one of the other important things, and then I'm sort of slowly going to, you know, trying not to give too much detail, is of course, you know, that this sort of historical, you know, trying to explain these things historically, then also forces us to look, for example, at Muslim reformism and sort of the emergence of modern, let's say, partly modern revivalist movements in slightly different ways, and also the way in which they sort of connect to earlier developments and also react to sort of that European encroachment and so on and so forth. So, and here we actually have a sort of a development that is twofold. On the one hand, you do have both, within Sunnism and within Shiism, you have revivalist movements that seek to sort of go back to the origins of the faith, purify the faith, and that actually in that process are often quite critical of the, relative other branch and also of other Muslims of their branch, which do not follow them. And there's no way of getting around that. These movements become very important. And here we're not talking only about the Wahhabis on the Arabian Peninsula, but also, for example, in India, there's a local, the Naqshbandi, Deobandi sort of movement that takes that angle. I mean, it comes to this conclusion from a different theological angle, but is also very Sunni-centric and anti-Shii. And likewise, on the Shii level, you have sort of the emergence of Usuli Shiism as the main form of 12 Shiism, and specifically as a religion of state, in which clerics play a very important role. And these clerics actually are often quite, harsh on others, including on Sufis and on other Sunnis. So actually, are not so interested in this sort of confessional ambiguity at all that I described, but are also targeting those dividing lines, and become this movement becomes the dominant 12 Shii movement until today, and is actually incredibly important also in northern India, where it's ruled, and of course under the Qajars in Iran, but these Indian rulers, which then really finance the development of the shrine cities in Iraq, and lead to that sort of, the emergence of Usulism as the sort of mainstream of Shiism. And we have to somehow square that development with the emergence then of pan-Islam, of a Muslim reformism of a different kind, which actually seeks to bridge these dividing lines, and especially resist European colonialism through a sort of pan-Islamic angle. And here you see a picture of Deoband. I was actually fortunate enough to also go there, but this is all these other contexts now in India going on that sometimes complicate conversations on these matters. And here is two famous, of course, clerics, publicists that epitomize both a sort of a newfound Sunni and Shii self-consciousness that is really sometimes quite exclusive, but also are really the main figures of a sort of a new pan-Islamic, convergence, and they personally, for example, cooperated quite a lot in the early 20th century. But then, sort of as we move into the 20th century, we see that there's not a linear narrative which I can present to you, and things sometimes move like that. And sometimes you have an extreme event happening, and these figures, for example, several times follow out with each other and have, very fierce polemics against each other, but at other points converge again. And I do realize I'm sort of, how am I doing with time? Maybe slowly wrap up. Yes. So then I will probably not talk so much about perhaps the period that you're more familiar with, and I'm not going to read you my conclusion. You're lucky. But one of the things that, I was trying to show now also in this sort of in the opening, where it's more personal and more, showing also the difficulties and ambiguities in this whole story. Is of course also to go a bit against the sort of standard narratives, right, that we have and have developed over the last 20 years or so. One of the things is also that, of course, the Iranian Revolution was such a tremendously important event in world history, but also, of course, in the history of the region. And we're still in some ways living with the consequences of that and the misunderstanding of this event in the region. That's, of course, one of the things that I'm also trying to look at in the book. I had another research project where we actually looked at the impact of the revolution on specifically Sunni or more Islamism more broadly, and specifically Sunni Islamist movements, quite timely at the moment, in fact. But what is important that after the Iranian Revolution, of course, that sort of newfound assertiveness of Shii clerics and that, you know, the sort of, you know, Shii Islamism at the heart of this new project scared many of the rulers in the region and also some populations. And you see an extreme upsurge in sort of polemics and so on and so forth. But we also need to remember that at the time, this wasn't actually particularly seen as a Shii event. It was sort of described often as an Islamic awakening. Even the Western press didn't really describe it that way. It's only in certain countries which had already had a history of quite strong Sunni-Shii conflict that this really, you know, was seen in such a way. And yeah, for example, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Iraq, but even in Iraq, the coverage was, right, because the majority, I mean, even much of the Iraqi army was made up of Shia. So there was a sort of it was basically described as a sort of a Persian, right, event, sort of, you know, misguided, strange event, basically in Iraq. But nonetheless, you know, you had sort of a strong sort of polemical reactions and so on and so forth. But we do need to remember, yeah, that actually many Sunni Islamists, especially, were actually initially quite attracted to it. And this pan-Islamic rhetoric remained active until today. And, you know, Iran continues to organize these sort of pan-Islamic conferences. And, you know, if you of course, ask a normal Syrian, you know, lived through the catastrophe of the last decade, you know, what they think about this, they don't find it very funny. But this continues in some ways. And one could argue also that, for example, I mean, the axis of resistance, right, that one hears about a lot today is in many ways the legacy. I mean, it's the intellectual and institutional legacy, actually, of this, you know, export of the revolution in a pan-Islamic way, but which worked mostly, of course, towards specific Shia movements and some of the Sunni movements that had no other means. But it's quite important to understand this event in a more, I guess, a historical way, also, you know, connecting it to some of these other movements. And then, of course, importantly, as you all know, in the last in the last 15 years or so, we had many movements that very specifically, especially in the Arab Spring, denounced any form of cultural division, and the slogans were generally quite amazing. And now, even when we look at countries like Egypt and so on and so forth, I mean, the sort of trying not to be divided in culturally specific or religious ways was an you know, attempt of all of these movements. And here, I guess, I have often argued that it was actually the regimes that managed to sort of reinvoke that in one way or another. And we have also actually seen now, if we go back to sort of the longue durée, we've seen some sort of clerical dialogues and sort of common statements coming out in the last 10 years or so, which are really unprecedented almost in history. Sort of, you know, the acceptance of for example, all the madhahib as, you know, valid, you know, so nobody as being completely outside of Islam. I mean, I don't think we've had a full recognition sort of Shiism by the major Sunni institutions, but we're sort of like, if we look at it from a very classical perspective, you know, what did the clerics sort of say historically? There's actually some quite amazing and dramatic developments over the last 10 years or so, specifically in response to the extreme violence and conflict, especially, of course, of the Islamic State. So I thank you all for your time, and I think you know, I've highlighted quite a lot of different points. And in general, I just wanted to point out that it is, of course, a story of increasing hardening sort of sectarian identities. If we think back really to that complete period of confessional ambiguity, that people didn't even use the terms and so on and so forth. And I think that's probably the case now in most I mean, most places where Sunnis and Shia, live next to each other. I mean, I remember, for example, visiting Indonesia a couple of times, and that was just at the moment when you started to have Indonesian Islamist movements talking about the Shii threat and so on and so forth. But many people just asked, what was this really about? And when they heard that I sort of work on it, they sort of wanted to know from me, what's this really about? What's the Sunni Shia? Are there Shia here in Indonesia? Who is that? Like, and what are we? Like, so that really was still the case, I think, well, 10, 15 years ago. But I think now, in many places you've had a sort of I think at least sort of a certain polarization, and I think we cannot get away from that. But of course, things are much more nuanced than they're often presented. And also, quite importantly, I would argue it's important to take the debates in the particular languages and regions. I mean, domestic Islamic debates seriously, and try not to impose, for example, this whole church-state, church-sect dichotomy, and arguing that one group is right or one group is wrong. I mean, from an academic perspective, and I think that's what I've been trying to do here. So, I mean, I've spoken for too long, and I'm really very excited that you all came, and it's a very interesting and diverse audience. So I'm really looking forward to your questions. So thank you very much.